Hello Dev Tipsters, we are now near the end of this series where we've been building my personal website for the past few months. I'm very excited about it. And there are a few odds and ends I want to tie up, and one of the things that was really bothering me was that the JavaScript that we wrote was a bit messy. Andrew put it best in the comments when he said that the JavaScript was a bit clunky. So I asked someone who's a lot better than me at JavaScript to come on the show and do a kind of code review for us. In the real world, things like this happen all the time. You might inherit a code base and you have to figure out what the original developer was intending. You might be contributing to open source projects, or you might be asked to help a friend or just return to code that you did a while ago and be like, whoa, what the heck? So today we're going to see in real life how someone would approach the task of refactoring. So we're going to be looking at three things: optimizing the scripts, maintaining dry principles, and coding style. So let me introduce you to someone I just met a few weeks ago at Circles Conference. Say hello, Fred.
Hey, what's up?
I'm glad that you could join me tonight. I know it's staying up late for you. You're on the other side of the continent. But we just wanted to get this done. So the discussion tonight is about this JavaScript file that I sent you, and you've been kind enough to look over it for me already, and you have some notes for me. I'm ready to learn.
All right. Okay, so at first glance of this file, it looks like that you're trying to achieve certain jQuery functionality for your homepage of the website, right?
That's right.
Okay, so so one of the key concepts I'd like to talk about tonight mainly involve modularization, variables, scope, and strict standards, and additionally DOM loading of certain of these objects on this computer screen. So currently what I see here, so one thing that's good is that you kind of kept up to some of the functional modularity that's going on here. Mm-hmm. But some of the problems are definitely, or some of your problems are most certainly how you handle events. So for instance, one of the first things I did when I looked at your file was I said, okay, so we have this mobile nav. We're trying to swap out classes. What's the best way to do this? So the first thing I did is I tried to break it up into a self-invoking function. So to start off a self-invoking function, you pretty much start off your functions like so. Right? So this general construct not only encapsulates whatever content you're going to put into it, but also invokes it the moment the script is parsed and loaded. So what in the computer science world, this is what's called a lambda function. But in JavaScript, you might know these as closures or anonymous functions. So first things first, we need to pass in our parameters. So first things first, jQuery is globally defined in window, which is just this right here. Window is always a variable. jQuery is defined in it, so we have to bring it into the scope of our function. So to do that, we pass jQuery in as a parameter into our self-invoking lambda function. So by doing this, we can now encapsulate whatever functionality we're going to do. So what I always typically start off with is writing in document, if I could spell it, and then .ready, and creating a closure inside of that. So typically on jQuery docs, you'll see a $sign, within as part of the function parameter right here. But since we're already passing it in right here, we don't necessarily need that. So another thing to note is that according to this function, we have this selector right here, which is mobile nav toggle, and we have another selector, mobile nav. So the next thing I did is I determined, what do we really need for our mobile navigation? And for this, I was just like, okay, so just by looking at your code, I knew that it was a toggle right there. Yep. So what I did right here is I defined a variable within the scope of this function that's globally accessible via all the other functions to bring in the toggle button so that we can directly attach event handlers to it. So to do that, what you kind of had already was correct by using the .on. This means that if it hasn't loaded yet, it's going to attach a binding event to it regardless. However, in this case, we've ensured that it always loads. So whenever the document's ready, this function will always be ready to be invoked.
Now,
so,
Fred, what's the difference in doing like the work on line number 9 and combined with line number 12 versus what's happening on line number 1?
That's a good question. Okay, so a lot of times when working with JavaScript, you're bound to run into conflicts, right? For instance, there's no guarantee that this variable right there, which is defined as a jQuery object by default since jQuery is loaded in, there's no guarantee that that's actually going to mean jQuery. For instance, if you're using other libraries, a lot of times $sign is assigned to something else. So technically, if I did, $sign equals the string yo, that's going to break all that, and then all of your jQuery from within throughout the rest of the document. So by doing this self-invoking function right here, we're directly passing in the jQuery library into this encapsulated function right here, right? So the $sign used in here to access jQuery overwrites this globally defined $sign up here. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
So everything that I would be writing in this entire document would be inside of the, how do you say it, a self-invoking function?
We'll just call it lambdas, but yeah.
Lambdas.
That's one way. You'll see later in my code that I broke your file up into several self-contained modules.
Got it.
And this is for an entirely different purpose, which I can always talk about a little bit later. But
sure, yeah, that answers my question for now.
Okay, yeah. So, so what I tend to do next is I create a function for the actual click event. So on button click, right? Now there's different ways you can go about creating these functions. This is just my particular style and taste. JavaScript is one of those languages where you can do the same thing almost millions of times. So this is just my particular flavor. So I always pass in the event because when you invoke these events, it's always going to pass in that parameter, so button click. This is the exact same thing as just writing in, well, actually doing this right here pretty much, except we're kind of decoupling that from the actual binding event. There's reasons to do this, more control. That's all I can think of right now off the top of my head, but so that's just something I generally like to do. Okay, so moving on. So when this gets clicked, we want to fire this function, right? So this function does a couple of things. First, it checks the status to see if the class, or if this particular element has the class is open, and then if so, target 2 more elements and then swap out their classes. Now, the funny thing about this here is you straight up did a branch statement, if status. So I assume, we're going to say if it has the class is open, it's going to be true. So if it's true, remove the class is open so we can close it, else open it, right? Well, jQuery has a neat little function called toggle class. So when I went through your code, I literally replaced this whole if statement with just doing 2 toggle classes. So I'll demonstrate that here in a moment. So another thing I like to do is, like, any variables that directly pertain to the scope of this function, I always like to define them. So in this case, it's mobile nav and the toggle button itself. So
now, why would you want to cache those if you're only going to dip in kind of once? Is it more efficient that way, even though you're only doing it once?
Well, that's a good question. In this particular case, I guess it doesn't really matter.
It's just good practice, you're saying? Or?
Yeah, because what JavaScript does is it hoists variables up. So technically, if I defined a variable right here. So right. So if I define this variable here at the bottom of the script, what that does is when it comes time to interpretation for the JavaScript, it's going to take that variable and then shove it up top. So then it's going to become, you know, similar to something like this, right? So this is for performance of the actual JavaScript runtime. You know, in the computer science world, there's a very good reason for defining your variables up top. Because if you think about it, you can't access memory if you don't have it defined.
Yep.
Is one way to, you know, look at it. So what JavaScript does is it hoists those variables up to the top. So that way it's saying, okay, let's define what we're going to put here in memory first before we access it. Because otherwise you're going to get nasty JavaScript errors of, you know, X, Y, and Z is of type undefined because, well, it hasn't been defined, right? So, you know, it's always good practice to define your variables first. But also it's worth noting that if you're not careful with, and this is a huge issue with JavaScript, in my opinion, but if you're not careful with scope, you have the potential of overwriting variables accidentally by sheer hoisting alone. So if I defined foo down below, right, and I named it like, instead of naming it or defining it as bar, and I named it as, say, my name Fred, there's a potential for foo to be overwritten with Fred if it just happens to hoist it below the current definition of foo, which is fine if that's what you're expecting. But what if that happens before? What if it hoists it up before foo, or if foo is equal to Fred and you need it to be Fred, but instead it's bar, right? So, you know, hoisting, you never know what the order is going to be for your variables, so it's always good practice to define them up top. And then also, you know, for the same reason that, you know, JavaScript does define all their variables up top, is the same reason why we're going to do it here. You know, we have to have it defined before we can access it, right?
Right.
So that's what we're just going to do right here. What I did next in regards to doing the events, I just, you know, did, I shouldn't say, you know, but toggle class is open. Well, can you guess what that does?
Yeah, toggle class is a jQuery function that will check and see if the element has that class, in this case, is open, and if it does, it will remove it, and if it does not, it will add it.
So that's correct. So we replaced these lines of code with simply selectors.toggleClass is open. So yes, you'll lose some bit of control by removing the branching statement, which is an if function, or not function, if statement. But at the same time, though, we're looking for, you know, efficiencies at this point. So this is one way to be more efficient with your jQuery, is to really know what function does the job you're trying to do. And in this particular case, what we're trying to do is we're going to say, okay, on this click, find our selectors, right? And then just toggle class is open.
Yep.
In my actual code review, I broke it down a little bit further. So another thing I do is I like to define, if I'm referring to the element that's invoking this this event, I like to, at the top of the variable, or at the top of the function, always say $this equals this. So what I'm really doing here is I'm saving us the trouble of having to type this multiple times throughout the scope of this function.
Yeah.
Now, the benefit of this, of defining this as this, is that we're not instantiating new jQuery objects every single time we use it. We're defining it once, and it applies across all cases because this is this, right? So this is another performance boost or enhancement right here, because by defining your selectors multiple times throughout the lifetime of the function, you're invoking more instances of these objects, you're assigning to the variables, therefore using up more memory. So I always like to define this, at least for events, mostly at the top with this equals this. So that way I can kind of distinguish, okay, I know I'm in this, but do I really need to create new instances of this all the time, right?
Right.
And then as the same below for selectors, since I kind of removed the other class, I just did this dot toggle class is open, selectors dot toggle class is open, okay?
Okay.
So that's a lot of concepts for one function, am I right?
No, this is good. That's what we want. I wanted to learn how to write, optimized and dry code right here, and like with good style as well. I think style is kind of important when you're having your code reviewed by other people, especially when you're going for like a job interview or something like that. So
oh yeah, definitely. Readability is, that's the king of the land, I suppose. Readability, maintainability, those should be your goals when writing software. Efficiency is definitely coming in at a close, third or second. But there is a time and a place for efficiency. But if you can kind of get that happy mix of all three, you're actually writing very good software. And by maintainability, I mean we're creating this Lambda function as its own self-contained module, and that's another concept too, is modularity within your code, which later on, when I actually show what I did for the majority of this file, you can see how I kind of use modularity to my advantage to create the set interval for your little. You have like these shaky tiles on your.
That's right. Yeah, the shaky tiles.
Homepage, and that's what that does. So I use modularity pretty extensively to get that functionality, and then also to extend it so that way, if you ever needed something else, you can use the same code and it will get the same effect, just different results on the on how you implement it, I suppose. Okay, so we went through the whole basic process of creating a small little modularized little event handler, right? So what do you think? Tackle something a little bit more complicated?
Well, so let me just ask you a few questions about it. Can you scroll up all the way again?
Yeah.
Okay, so now what I've been doing in the past is using that function that you find on line number 3 as the jQuery initial function. So it's like once the page is loaded, then run these other things. And that's just kind of how I've been doing it for a few years, and I like it for a few reasons. Number one, it's kind of like a table of contents, if you will. It keeps track of all the functions that are on this page, as well as makes certain that they run at certain times and at the right time. How would you kind of like document that this self-instantiating function is here, or this Lambda function is here, and that it's running?
Files.
You'd break this from line 11 to 27 into its own file?
Line 11 and 27, yes.
Got it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, I mean, depending on the situation, this is something I would consider as a global or functionality piece. So I would kind of group global things together. So more global stuff like let's see here. So some of the global things that I've identified, at least with this particular file so far, was really just the toggle, and then also the where is that at? And then the your click right here to kind of do that smooth scroll throughout the application. I kind of implemented that a unique way too, if you wanted to go through that as well.
Sure, let's do that.
All right, cool. So, following a similar process as before in this code, if we just consider this, Lambda as our global functionality, right? So I just kind of named this as blank A tags or something, right? So we're going to select them and save them. Almost like the set it and forget it commercial from the 90s. Right, so I'm just going to do some copying and pasting real quick just to make things a little bit easier on me. All right.
Do you want to kind of tell us what you're doing while you're copying and pasting?
Oh, I'm just setting this up exactly how I set up the button click for right now.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah. We'll just give it an arbitrary name. So as far as readability goes, clear function names, clear variable names kind of are necessary to kind of describe exactly what's what on within the code. Just thought I'd make a slight mention of that. Okay, so something I tend to do is if I'm directly extracting pieces of attributes or information from an element, I generally try to break it up into their own variables. I tend to do this just because usually in software that I write, there's always a huge possibility I have to change it later on or modify it in some way. So having it already broken up into its individual components really makes it easier on me, at least, to manipulate, work with, change, whatever, right? So I'm going off of your code right here, I noticed that we have a specific target that we want to animate to. So this would be this target.offset right here. So for all of those who don't know, target.offset is basically saying get the element's position relative to the scroll or the document height or width or whatever, and then top is obviously where the element sits on the page relative to the height. I think the other ones are left and right, right?
I think it's just top and left.
Oh, top and left. Okay, yeah. So basically it gives you the coordinates or pixel coordinates of where this thing's located. So we'll just keep that in mind. So I noticed that in order for a scroll to work, we need to have a target, right? So one of the benefits of breaking out the href is that I can explicitly define the target element that we're trying to select and just plug it into a jQuery object. So, and this gives me free reign to modify that href whenever I please, but not affect the target at all.
That's cool. I've never seen that before.
Oh, you never have? Well,
oh yeah, that's
prepare
awesome.
to have your mind blown. Okay, so length. Pretty much every function object array has this length property to it. And basically, it does exactly what it says. It says how much elements are contained or properties are contained within this object. jQuery is weird in that when you actually print out a jQuery object on the screen, it's kind of like an array with properties, not really an object. I don't know. It's kind of strange, but always know that there is a length part to it. So this will give you the exact elements that are there. So you always want to make sure that if you're going to be using the length, you always want to check for greater than 0 if you want to make sure that something exists. Because otherwise, if it is equal to 0, it does not exist. And if you have multiple ones, you just don't want to check for just one, because if you have multiples, maybe you want to know only run this branch if there's multiple of X, Y, and Z.
Right. So let me just kind of tell you what I was going for, and you can kind of tell me where I went wrong. So what I was trying to say is, now mind you that target at that point is the href of the link you just clicked, which should be a string value. So like let's say your href is equal to the about section, so hashtag about.
Mm-hmm.
So what this is trying to say is if you click on something, let's make sure that there's something inside the href. And that's all I was trying to go for. I mean, yeah, tell me from knowing that where it went wrong.
I wouldn't say it went wrong necessarily. This is two different approaches to the same problem.
Okay.
Because obviously for those of you who don't know, one way to scroll on a screen without using jQuery or anything like that, just by default HTML scroll on a screen. If you create an element with the ID of whatever, right?
Yeah.
If you have
about.
Yeah, if you have a link that says hashtag whatever the name is, if you click on that link, it will automatically take you to that spot on the page. So what this is doing here, this function is just smoothing out that process.
Yep.
So based off that information, I know that the href is going to contain the ID of the element that we want to get, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just by saying, okay, let's go ahead and target that. Now, if it doesn't exist, fine. We're not going to run our branch. But if it does exist, and if there's multiples of it, we know that. So we're going to go ahead and animate the window.
Right.
So we do that by simply using this selector and then animating to the target's offset. Now, one thing I did do is I did break the body out into, let's see here. I did break that out. Again, this is for the same purpose. We don't know if we're going to use this throughout the rest of this this lambda, so it's always good to kind of. But if we do decide that we're going to use it throughout, it's already going to be defined for us, so we can always reference that within here because it is in the global scope of this whole self-contained module.
Okay.
And that's pretty much all I did with that one. But the only difference that I really came up with was, other than showing a different use for how to get the same effect, I did define a settings variable on top here. There are instances, and you'll see this in my code in regards to the timer module that I created, that sometimes you want settings. So if we have a duration of 300 milliseconds, we can define that up top, and then down here we can say settings.duration. And that way, if we ever want to change our duration, we can just go, hey, top of the file, I want it to be 1 second.
Right.
Boom, done. One thing I forgot to mention, depending on how your files are loaded into the DOM, sometimes, and I did demonstrate this in my code, but sometimes you may want to define your jQuery stuff down here. The reason why I don't is because using this self-invoking, we're already assuming that jQuery is there, therefore it's able to find the elements. But in the event it's not, sometimes it's good to define your variables back here, but at the same time, at the top, have them be like that so you can still access them throughout the function if you're using an IDE or something that does auto-completion. I should have made that a little bit clearer sooner, but that's something I also do.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But for the purposes of this video, we can ignore that for now. You guys will see it in the code later.
Okay.
But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's how I defined your global functionality of your website.
Okay.
So maybe I would call this global.js or something, right? And just include it in the header.
The page, it's like you would make a new file from 11 to 48 and then make that a global. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Cool. Is that kind of like, I mean, we're not going through the whole file tonight, but like this kind of pattern of like modularizing things. Mm-hmm. Is there any other things that you saw going through this that you would kind of give me a tip at?
That's a good question. Honestly, Not really. I mean, other than just some quirky things with some of the jQuery, like the knowing when to use toggle versus actually branching out and doing your own switching yourself. Other than that, mainly what I noticed most was you kind of had an idea or a grasp of modularization, but from what I could tell is that this shows that you understand the importance of it, but you're not doing anything with scope. You're not doing anything with hoisting. You're not doing anything with efficiencies as far as declaring variables once and then using them throughout, right? So that's mainly what I noticed in regards to your code tonight.
Well, that's a lot less severe than I thought it was going to be.
Oh, no. I mean, trust me, I've seen worse. I've written worse. So, and then just one last thing I want to point out. This fancy little statement. Use strict. We all hate Internet Explorer. We don't want it to complain about our JavaScript, so use strict.
What does that do now?
Okay, so use strict, by defining this within a scope of a function, you're basically saying strict standards only. So that means no goofy JavaScript, all compatibility, works everywhere. Good stuff.
Okay, cool, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show tonight, and everybody who is cringing about the JavaScript I was writing, helping them to relax a little bit. How can people find you online, Fred?
Well, thanks to Circles and How I Met Travis, I now have a Twitter account. My handle for that is LT Superbus. For all of you Latin nerds out there, Superbus means arrogant in Latin.
Cool. And we'll have that link down in the description below.
Right. And then GitHub, it's FREDLAWL. That is what I'm known on GitHub. Be warned, I don't do much contributing, but hopefully this video is a start for me.
Dude, well, we're so glad to have you on, and it's an awesome contribution to the family over here at DevTips, and you're welcome back anytime. So thank you so much, and good night.
Yeah, good night, man. I need some sleeps.
Thanks again to Fred for taking his personal time to do this with us, and his personal contacts are in the video description below in case you wanted to send him a thank you for spending his time here today. This video and many others like it are made possible by the contributions of our patrons. Check out patreon.com/devtips to find out how you can support the show. Next week we're going to get that wrap-up video done, so stay tuned for that. But until then, keep on hacking.